for young women, high school-aged young women, an elite kind of program to immerse themselves over the course of the summer in the study of primarily Talmud, rabbinic texts, and Tanakh, and questions of Jewish identity. The program is officially a non-denominational program, open to everyone. Given that the bar for study is actually quite high, the textual bar of study, it does self-select predominantly from an Orthodox community, but it is open, and we do have kind of a constituents from all over. And the program over the years, it's a 30-year-old program, so just one piece where the core of my education comes to the fore. The program over the course of the years has become, it was primarily for Americans and has subsequently, morphed more into a global program. So about 2/3 come from North America and 1/3 Israel, Europe. We get a group. It's only 26 spots in this program. And what I have found really quite interesting about the program, it's a really self-selecting, engaged group of students, is that over the course of the years, as we've opened it more and more to women from Israel, I am finding contemporaries, colleagues of mine who grew up in the United States, moved to Israel, in Aliyah, live in all different parts of the country, now in many ways have just been in touch, and here's sort of like personal stories of friends, literally, who call me up and say, I want my daughter to have an experience studying text outside of Israel, right? Not experiencing New York. Yes, they experience New York. The program is very sort of New York City as our landscape, as our classroom. We have classes in museums, in the park, and it really integrates to the text. But at its core, it's a Beit Midrash program, high bar, 9 o'clock in the morning, 3 hours of Talmud, and really kind of like integrating in this mixed group till late at night. But friends who grew up in North America as North American Jews who subsequently moved to Israel are now raising their children and saying, I want them to have this intellectual, curious experience, rigorous intellectual, curious experience of studying texts, Jewish texts, not religious in a religious context per se, but studying Jewish texts in America, in New York, in a cosmopolitan city, in a world where they'll study that text and then kind of walk outside, and a great cosmopolitan city as a landscape kind of brings the text to the fore, and what we experience, what the students experience walking around the Morgan Library and the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Washington Square Park is brought back into questions of the text. And it's been fascinating for me to see that sort of like anecdote bit, those conversations, and there have been multiple conversations like that, because to me that says, well, there's the power of the diaspora, right? It seems somewhat counterintuitive to say, you leave Israel and you study the Jewish text outside of Israel, right? We have gap year, we have birthright, we go to Israel, we experience Jewish life, Jewish text in Israel, and that's kind of, right, our yeshivot, our michlalot, religious, secular, university, that's where we experience Jewish text. But actually, there's a tremendous power to saying, what happens when we experience those texts outside of Israel, right? Whether it's in the thriving community in Berlin, where there's a new journal on Hebrew language in Hebrew being published for one of the first times, Mikan Velech, which is a fascinating thing, in New York, in Palo Alto, in Mexico City. There's a vibrancy to studying Jewish texts and reflecting on questions of Jewish identity and in the diaspora. And that is something that I've seen then kind of creates a cohort of, in my case, right, learners who learn about each other through the study of text in the places where they're most at home. And so, teaching in this context, I teach in a lot of different contexts, but in this context, teaching adolescent young women who, for the most part, actually, the Israelis and the Americans don't really have a sense of the diaspora identity. What does it mean to be both Americans and North Americans and Israelis? Don't really know much about diaspora life, let alone Jewish diasporic life. Like, what does it mean to leave and kind of, find yourself in Riverdale in the Bronx, where there are more synagogues and cultural institutions and Jewish institutions, and a lot of the Israeli young women from all across the country just never expected anything like that. And to do that, anchored in a text, so that questions of the relationship between Israel and diaspora are rooted in a central tradition, right, where the text is actually, this is what we're studying. Right? We're studying the text. We're not studying the text about Israel or about America or about, right, the Persian kingdom of Esther. We're studying kind of the text in whatever way that manifests. So questions of, Talmudic questions of public domain and private domain, which are non-contextualized in terms of identity, actually will lead to very serious questions and reflections of individual identity when studied among students who are coming immersed together from very different backgrounds. And then they walk into a public domain, and they walk into Washington Square Park, and an Israeli young woman from Ramat Beit Shemesh, studying with a girl from Hanover, New Hampshire, who lives on Dartmouth campus, says, hey, I don't have anything like this in my life. What does it mean? Is this a public domain? Is this a private domain? How does my life experience speak to the reality on the ground, anchored and centered in the text? And so in many ways, I'm going to sort of close up here, that to me is the power, right, of diaspora. Things used to be much more binary. In the times of the Talmud, you had one rabbinic sage who traveled back and forth, and they're highlighted as they traveled from Israel to Babylonia and brought with them kind of, right, the discussions that were moving in both directions. But now, things don't need to be so binary. We touched upon it this morning. You can live your life in one place, but actually spend chunks of time in another and imbibe that identity. I brought my family in Israel a few years ago for sabbatical, academic sabbatical. 4 kids, threw them into Israeli schools, had the Israeli experience, part of Tzofim, part of the group, so that they can get that. And then actually not everybody can pick up their family, but there are ways today that when we think about education, I know we think about the context of the classroom, there's actually education writ large in terms of life experience and experiential education as being kind of the ways that we can inform our identity, our text as anchoring that identity, and all the different ways that can look if we are deliberate about how we structure it.
Great. Thank you, Shira. Ron, can you share with us a story of your own experience that speaks to this question?
I'm not much of a storyteller, but I'll share with you a little bit about my background and why I'm here. I'm sort of in a good position to be here on this panel, which I'm honored to be on. I think because I am both an ex-Israeli who's now made his life in the United States. So I know a little bit about the Israeli education system, enough to know that the opening statement that the Israeli education system ignores the diaspora is utter nonsense. In fact, it's sort of malicious nonsense. It's just not true. I am now a professor at UC Berkeley, a place which until 7-10 years ago was not a particularly friendly place for students, Jewish or Israeli. That has changed quite dramatically. There's been a sort of Jewish Israeli renaissance on the Berkeley campus, which I'm very, very happy to play a small part in. On all fronts. Jewish life is flourishing at Berkeley. We're teaching more classes than ever before. And the Israel Institute, which I co-direct at the Berkeley Law School, brings 6 to 12 Israeli professors every year to teach classes around campus. Those aren't just your usual suspect classes about Israeli war making, Israeli peacemaking, Zionism, history of the Jewish people, but classes that are that seek to deeply normalize the study of Israel, Israeli agriculture, Israeli drama and art, Israeli architecture, Israeli economics, Israeli technology and innovation, Israeli law. Our targets in teaching these classes, and they've been super over-enrolled, the success has been just wonderful to observe. Our targets are, of course, mainly American students on the Berkeley campus. So here's my story. My story occurs at a moment at which I'm talking to my class in sort of a almost nonchalant way about the great Jewish expulsions from England, from France, from Spain. And a student in the front row says, what do you mean expulsions? Like how many? And I said, all of them. And he said, what do you mean? How many of England's Jews were expelled? And I said, listen, buddy, for 300 years there were no Jews in England, not one. Why am I telling you this story? Because he was a Jewish student. He wasn't an American student who isn't supposed to know about the diaspora. He was an American student who is, like many Jewish Americans I encounter in daily life, woefully undereducated. So the way this panel here is set up today is to ask, what can the diaspora teach Israeli students? What can Israel teach diaspora students? And I'd like to direct the question into a third corner, which is, what can the diaspora learn about itself? I think there's a lot of work to be done here. And I have to admit that work is now the focus of my career. I've left Israel. It's quite a conscious and very, very painful decision. But I followed love, so I have a good excuse. And I have a family here. My focus is not on educating Israelis. My focus is on educating Americans, and the Israel Institute at Berkeley does a pretty good job at that. I find that Americans and American Jews especially have a great deal to learn about themselves and are often far more ignorant than Israelis are about the diaspora and the history of the diaspora. Let me give you a couple of quick examples. Example number one, if any of you has an iPhone out and you'd like to open Google Maps, you can do this exercise with me. Ask Google Maps to find the nearest Golda Meir street. Any guesses as to where that might be? To us, we're in Palo Alto. Where's the nearest Golda Meir street?
San Francisco.
Los Angeles, San Francisco. Incorrect.
You would think Milwaukee.
You would think Milwaukee. There is not a Golda Meir street in Milwaukee. There is not one in Chicago. Well, then he needs to call Google Maps and Waze and let them know, because both of them claim that the nearest Golda Meir street is in Holon, Israel. There is not a Golda Meir street in the United States, but there's a Golda Meir Square, there's Golda Meir School, there's Golda Meir retirement community. I and Google Maps do not know of a single Golda Meir street in the United States of America. When I took my children to Israel for a sabbatical to study in a local Israeli elementary school, they went to Louis K. Brandeis Elementary School in Herzliya, which is on Louis K. Brandeis Street. And every student in that school knew who Louis K. Brandeis was, and I think they would have a very easy time competing with their American Jewish peers on that front. I dare you to gather into this room 10 Israeli high school students and 10 American Jewish high school students, and ask those two groups to name great Jewish medieval leaders, great Jewish Enlightenment leaders, or ask them, what happened in May 1942 at the Biltmore Hotel in New York? See who knows the answer. And I will bet you the Israelis know more about the history of the diaspora than the diaspora Jews know about the history of the diaspora, because you cannot graduate an Israeli high school without knowing, at least you're not supposed to. Maybe you could squeeze by, but you're not supposed to graduate from an Israeli high school. I certainly didn't, without knowing about the Biltmore Conference. So that's the first idea I'd throw out there. I think there is a tremendous amount that Israelis can learn from the diaspora and vice versa. I think the diaspora is falling quickly behind in terms of learning about itself. So that's the first quick point I wanted to make. My second point is quicker. And it has to do with my third identity, which is I'm an international politics scholar. It's what I study. And part of what we teach our students in basic introductory class international politics is great powers don't last forever. They rise and they fall. I hope, since I have made my future and my family's future in this country, that the Israeli-American axis will remain a crucial axis in years to come. History suggests otherwise. Great powers rise and fall, and the Jewish people have always been very smart at tying their fortunes with whoever's in charge. The other Zion used to be in Spain. And then for a while it was in the Ottoman Empire. And then for a while it was in Germany. And then we tied our fortunes with the British, and then we tied our fortunes with the French. The American-Israeli axis is barely 50 years old. There is no reason to assume that it is going to last another 50 years. As far as great centers of Judaism and knowledge about Judaism go, I am far more confident about Israelis and how they're educating themselves about the history of Judaism than I am about Americans, which is, again, that's why I'm here. That's why my focus is now on my children, on your grandchildren. That is now my calling. I don't care about what happens in Israel. It's not a country I live in anymore. The reason why I think the Israel Institute at Berkeley is doing holy work is because we are reminding our children and our grandchildren where they come from, what it means to be Jewish, what Jewish law is, what Jewish society is, what Jewish history is. That's where I think our focus should be.
Yael, a story, or you already have stuff you want to say, I can see on your face. So
Good. I'm trying to be a little.
Yeah. Okay, so my name is Yael, and I grew up in the Israeli education system. That's why my English is so bad, but I'm sorry for that. And I have my experience is different. Like when I think about it, I can say I grew up. I'll tell you when the first time I met the diaspora Jews. I was 25 after the first degree, and I went to India, and I came back. I asked myself what I'm going to do with the first degree in sociology, say, and then I saw in the newspaper, that's the way you found jobs. So I saw that there's a young Judea gap year coming to Israel, and they are looking for an Israeli facilitator, a group facilitator. And I said, oh, that's very interesting. And it came to that interview, and he, the manager, he asked me, what do you know about the diaspora Jews? I said, I don't know anything. So I don't know. Like, I have cousins somewhere. I knew that I had cousins, but I said I really don't know. And I grew up in the Israeli educational system. We never, we heard about the Jews that living not in Israel, but because we need their money. Okay, that's the way we were told about them. But I didn't know. I think I never saw a map of the world, learning where are there Jews, where are they living, what does it mean to be a Jew. And what I learned in Israel is I think we learned that the Jewish history, it's all about us, okay? We learned how people came to Israel, the Aliyah Rishona, like the first Aliyah, the second Aliyah, the third, they were all the same, okay? But we learned about each one of them for a few months, okay? And all these Aliyot we learned about is the Aliyot from Europe to Israel. We didn't learn about the Aliyot from other diasporas, not about the from the Arab countries. We didn't learn about that, and not about America. So I came to be a group facilitator when I was 25, and it was a group of religious and non-religious and reform and conservative, like what you have in America. And at the second day, it was Monday, and the girls said, we want to have a woman reading Torah. And I said, what? Okay, it was for me the first time I heard about it. Okay, and I said, okay, what do you need for that? And they said, we need the Sefer Torah. Okay, so we went to the rabbi of that course, and he said, okay. And then it was the first, for me, it's the first time I was part of a woman minyan. Okay, and I was sitting there, and I saw these 18 years old girls reading the Torah, saying the Baruch, and I'm like, what? How do you know what to say? And that was for me, the first time I knew that there is, what does it mean? And what, for them, when they grew up in such an options, how to be a Jew, how to be a woman, to know what to do in synagogue. I know what to do in synagogue, but I always sit behind the mechitza, and something is happening there, and I'm saying amen. But I don't know, all the prayers and that. And for me, it's what was a very, very interesting year, and I felt that my Jewish world is going from this to that. Wow, there's so many options how to be a Jew, and now in Israel, we're here for the next 2 years because of my husband's work. But in Israel, we are part of a conservative community. But I didn't hear about the reform movement and the conservative movement. I didn't hear about it till I was 25, and that is. And I think in Israel we learn that everything is about us. We don't learn about the Arabs. We don't learn about the Jews out of Israel. We just learned about us. And this is something that I'm happy that my kids they have a different point of view, and so this is my story.
Thank you. Tova.
Yeah. Hi. I would like to share a story that helped me redefine so much of what I thought I knew about Jewish studies, Jewish education, so-called diaspora, so-called Israel, etc. I started about 4 years ago a Jewish Studies department in Ono College, in the college that I'm the dean of. And it's a graduate school, and I was interviewing 4 Kesim, 4 Ethiopian religious leaders and 1 Ethiopian rabbi, to get accepted to talk about the program. And I started asking them some things, and they were answering. And then, after about 5 minutes, I just stopped, and I started to cry so hard because I said, I have to apologize. I know so much about, I used to pride myself that I know how to read and write, and more or less, I'm interested in Jewish communities and different kinds of ways of being Jewish. So I can tell you the argument between the Rav Ovadia and the Rav Herzog on can they be included as Jews, can they, etc., all these. And I realized that I really know nothing about what it means to have been an Ethiopian Jew, to have prayed every day to come to Jerusalem. What does it really mean to have a Jewish community for thousands of years that did not share many of our assumptions or our oral law? That for us, what is Judaism? Judaism, we all know. So you're either more from or less from. You're Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. We have a few boxes. But I really, and everybody's deciding Hillel and Shammai. But what does it mean to be part of a Jewish community that doesn't have Hillel and Shammai? What kind of creativity went on there? How did they live? What was their relations with their neighbors? What kind of anti-Semitism did they face? What were some of the compromises? What was their oral law? Because everybody has an oral law. And how could it be that I was interviewing them 2013, they were already in Israel, full generation. I never had interviewed that before. I was so interested in this and that. And I made a neder, a vow that I told him at the end of this year, one of you is going to stay and going to start teaching what does it mean to be Ethiopian Jews to our Jewish studies. And it meant for me shifting what Jewish studies meant at all to be something called multicultural Jewish studies. I was brought up in that quote unquote, and I will keep it in quotes, pluralist Judaism, which usually means the person in power is defining who is allowed in and who's not out in that specific group. And Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, Reconstructionists all have done that, who's in and out. No one group has the monopoly on who's in and who's out and what we need to study about. But the ignorance, and then to really understand complete wipeout of a whole Jewish community as they live in Israel. And whenever I come to speak anywhere in the world, and I speak a lot, nobody asks, what do we have as a Jewish community to learn from another Jewish community who developed their own oral law, who made different kinds of negotiations? And then it started dawning on me, does anybody here know what Moroccan Jewish leaders, how they dealt with modernity, and that we're so sure that modernity was part of Europe, and that the Jews didn't think about anything, didn't write, didn't create. And it really, it shifted what it meant to build for me an academic Jewish studies department where we train teachers who are going to go back into the school systems and teach Jewish studies in the secular system and in the religious school systems. What did it mean to train police officers who were coming to do their, we have a lot, we have 150 police officers every year coming to their, what does it mean? What do they need to know? What do we need to know? And I'm saying this because we sometimes are so sure of our parameters of diaspora Israel. And when we talk about Israel, it's if we know what we mean about what are the Jewish communities. And it's almost like we know to ask, or many of us know to ask, this horrible question, not just how were Jews murdered in the Holocaust, but what was lost? Right? What don't we have because of it? But we don't ask that question about so many other communities. And that is why when they asked me and they got me on the spot, like, what's going to be your first agenda? And I gulped, and then I came back to say, my first agenda is to say who is going to sit in that room, who are going to represent that Jewish community. Who is, and what's the conversation going to be, and what are the challenges in that conversation? And then I think when we have that conversation, the notion of what's Israeli, what's diaspora, will change, will shift. And I think we can also then really come and say, there's a lot of creativity, there's a lot of incredible things that we don't know. And what would it mean then to bring that back into the conversation? What would that mean to say, yes, come back? And that's where we're all going to have to leave what we call our comfort zone. I know I had to leave it because I had to, as I said, I did the Jewish studies track, and I studied with my father. I didn't go to high school. I studied with my father for years, and my father's David Hartman, Zichrono Livracha, and I did all those different kinds of things. I came to Harvard, and it really made me feel like I have to study so much more and shift also, but it's not just intellectual, academic learning, but it's shifted questions. It shifts what does it mean to be part? What does it mean to be excluded? How do we bring people, using Bell Hooks' model, from margin to center? And I think that the activism part that I bring is that these are all Jewish communities that might have been in the margin or not. But no longer can we blame anybody else for them being in the margin. It's really up to us to say what are we doing every day to shift the boundaries and to shift that conversation.
No, so I'll say, Tova, as I was educated at the Hartman Institute for many years, and I did a lot of work on teacher training at Hartman where we spoke about pluralism, that what Tova put in quotes, pluralism. I was trained to be a rabbi of a Jewish school. And I was the rabbi of the Jewish high school in San Francisco for 5 years before working for Hartman. My wife still works there, it's a wonderful place. And I got to the school and I was like, oh, pluralism in San Francisco is not Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. But that's the language of training that I received, in part because if you go, I think on the East Coast, that's actually still sometimes the language, because what we say in San Francisco, not in a pejorative way at all, is we're 20 years ahead of whatever is happening in New York and whatever you think. So, but I'm struck by both that observation that you made, Tova, which is to say, our categories that we've defined for ourselves need examining. And I also find truth in what Ron is saying, which is to say, there feels like missing stuff. That, like, it's how do you navigate both bringing people in and expanding definitions and cultivating a sense of knowledge amongst all the participants involved. And so where that sends me is like, what are the goals? Why should Israelis and diaspora Jews, why should North American Jews and Jews from Buenos Aires, and we're starting to get into the problematics of the language, why should all these Jews be, why should they be learning about one another? What's the benefit of that? What's the goal of that? Should that be our central goal? Essentially we've gone very quickly to the question that I hope most Jews are asking, and certainly most Jewish educators are asking these days, which is what's their purpose? But where does this send you in terms of what, I guess the panel question seems to suggest an end goal that's obvious, and I want to problematize that. Is that our obvious end goal? Why Jewish peoplehood, I guess? Does that lead anyone want to jump in?
Question. It's a really
Very, very.
Just add to it. We used to have a discussion about what is what is the educated Jew? 20, 25 years ago, people wrote about. So to add to your question.
Okay, so that's I think it's an added thing. Is there a need for an educated Jew, or is it about cultivating practices? Is it about a mimetic tradition? What's the purpose? What do you aspire? Why do you think, what's the anxiety that this panel is trying to answer is really the question. Does someone want to share? You want to jump in?
I can jump in.
And then I'll stop by and people can yell at each other. People like that.
Let's go,
It's
yell.
like CNN. We should be boxes on
Not enough
screens.
I just kind of want to draw on what Tova said and maybe shift the question back a bit more. To me, if you ask what's the ultimate goal, it's actually about cultivating empathy to another. And you can't actually do that until you know another's narrative, learn with them, study with them, sit with them. And then it leads to questions of, is this practice? Is this mimetic? Is this historical? Is this an acquisition of knowledge? Is this how we functionally live our lives? But there's that, right, kind of precursor question, which is, well, until I actually experience another and hear the story of another, whether it's historical or I think for my purposes today, like the grounded reality, looking synchronically at where we are now, there are like many different Jewish narratives. And to learn and to study with somebody who has an entirely different narrative cultivates not just my sense of what Jewish peoplehood looks at, grand scale, writ large, in its beautiful, multifaceted way, but also what it means to be human. And we kind of like lose the human experience sometimes when we are often like situating right towards another, or vis-a-vis another, or the other. For my own experience, I think I had a similar kind of experience in Glamsta. Take out Google Maps. Anybody know where Glamsta is? I think of, there's an old, Swedish archipelago. There is a Jewish camp in Glamsta, 2 hours north of Stockholm. This stunning, old, rich, beautiful, lush, green campsite. And I was there as part of a fellowship. I continued to be involved with Pi Day Institute of Jewish Studies in Stockholm. And this was a fast, 3.5 years ago, just after my baby was born. I ran away to Stockholm for 10 days. For me, it was this like amazing, eye-opening experience. It was a fellowship for not just North American Jews and Israeli Jews, but the piece that we're leaving out in the binary is the large European Jewish community, contemporary Jews in Europe today, who kind of in the age of European multiculturalism many of them are readopting kind of Jewish identity in that face of this interesting multicultural identity marker. And that's Stockholm, Pi Day's 11, 12-year-old institute. And the fellowship that I was part of, the Paradigm Fellowship, brought together 26 of us, 3 from Israel, 5 from America, and then the rest were from countries of, we're sort of like really interesting emerging Jewish communities are re-emerging now. And when we sat and we studied text together, and we ate food that had, we learned how to make Swedish glögg, and we're singing with Ronnie Yeager from the Hartman Institute, singing Echad Mi Yodea in Bulgarian, and Art Green kind of explaining the mystical nature of where we are in the Baltics. Like there was this aha moment of we have Jews representative of 20 plus countries in that small cohort. And when we studied a text together, and one of the texts that we did study in Mishnah in Sanhedrin, talking about how each person is created in the image of God and kind of their own stamp and individualized and unique, that took on an entirely different spin when the peoplehood was actually the people sitting in the room. So there's the proximity piece, and when we think about, well, what does it mean and what is our, to contextualize, I think, just grasping the narrative of another is kind of a precursor question to, okay, actually, like, what are we doing now? So that's kind of building off of that. But.
So I have 2 audiences in whose education I'm interested in. Although they mesh perfectly, and I love them all as my students. But on the one hand, half of my audience is just Berkeley students who know very little about the world.
Yeah.
And I want to teach them about Israel the same way I want to teach them about China and Russia. Precisely in the same way. I want them to understand it is a country like any other. And I want them to appreciate that country in its fullness. And that's the prime thing that my Israel Institute does. The other audience is Jewish students at Berkeley. And them, I want to teach about Jewish values, Jewish law, Jewish history, and about Israel, because it is, in my mind, one of the most important glues that ensures their future viability. So again, I study international politics, I study nationalism, I study ethnicity. I know what it is that, I think I know what it is that keeps national and ethnic groups together and what causes them to fray. Jews living in Israel have a relatively easy time maintaining a certain type of Judaism because they are constantly commingling. They're serving in the army together. They dress alike in many ways. They eat the same food in many ways. They're constantly bumping into each other. They're also experiencing significant outside stress, which is sadly a very good recipe for endurance and for continuance. Jews in the greater diaspora outside the United States experience less of that, though there is often a very strong sense of identity. If you look at Jews in France, Jews in Buenos Aires, as you mentioned, not to mention, Jews in the former Soviet Union, because of these outside pressures, they don't assimilate as much as one might expect. So their Jewish identity is ensured, and they're also quite well aware of their own history and their own heritage. That is not the case with American Jews. Right. It really isn't. And as secularism takes hold of our community, we practice less than just Judaism together. We certainly don't dress alike. We certainly don't eat alike. We don't share many of the same political and ideological beliefs. We intermarry left and right. I think one of the most important glues that will ensure the future of Judaism in the United States is to be HaYehudi HaMechunach, to know who we are and where we came from and what it means to be us in terms of history, in terms of society, in terms of values, in terms of ideology.
Yael or Tova, do you have any thoughts?
I think I'm asking myself this question,
Yeah.
okay, and I'm the only reason I think we should deal with identity and Jewish identity is because it's interesting for us, okay, and I want my children to be Jews, and that's why I educate them to be Jews. But maybe I will have a friend or cousin or brother or sister that she doesn't understand why, and she said, I don't want my children to be Jews. I don't care if they will be Jews or not, and it will be okay. But I think the people who are here are the people who are asking the question, and because there is this question, then we need to ask, what does it mean to be a Jew? And as a person that's coming from Israel, and I see what's happening with the Jewish identity in Israel that is very orthodox, and there's only one way to be a Jew. And I'm asking myself, is this what I want to educate my children or to educate my students? And the answer is no. I want to teach them that there's so many options how to be a Jew, but that's not the way.
You're saying it's increasingly more difficult as the vision of Judaism in Israel really differs from the vision of Judaism in North America. Yeah,
so I think every child in Israel needs to come for 1 year in diaspora. We should do gap years to learn about Jews in diaspora.
I think that in Israel, we don't have to necessarily come to the United States to know about different Jews. We actually just have to go out of our neighborhood. And I think that the fact that so many schools are so ideologically, everybo's around a specific ideology. If it's the religious ones, every different size of a yarmulke has a school. And even the schools that do, whether they're religious and non-religious, so-called, and they try, and they're wonderful schools because they actually do try, but they too stay within a very specific narrative of what is and what's not and how it is. So I think it's not only why Jewish identity, but if Jewish identity, what is included in that thing called Jewish identity? And what I would like to suggest is that it's so much richer and it's so much more attractive. And And the minute we actually, like in my area, it used to be gender studies. I mean, it still is, but I've learned, I'm just spending time now learning other things. But like the basic question in say when, in feminist Judaism, et cetera, was about the invisibility of women. We take the notion, what it means, I think, is about invisibility. Who's invisible and how do we make it visible? And then I really do think in that process, Jewish education and will be so much more interesting, becomes so much more dynamic. It becomes so much less flat. There's this, and you know it, or this is the Jewish people. The words that we have to do in psychology, I was used to teaching my students, there's no such thing as ha-mitbagrim. I used to teach, my area was psychology of adolescence, and I used to always say there is no such thing as the. There are no the adolescents. In Hebrew, I could say, hey, was the hey idea is only for God. Everybody else is multiple. And that idea that, and when we actually can embrace, but first feel that there's also an obligation to know so much more, it really is an incredible tradition, and it's really an incredible lived tradition. Why we needed to, and this, when I say the we, I would say it's the collective we of North American Jewry and Israeli, those in power that needed to, and that's all of us have a sin. It's not like here they allowed some pluralist Jews, that it's not true. There's so that when we decide who is part of this narrative, and that I think it's so much more compelling and it demands of us so much more, but I think that we can create and help create something that's very, very, that's much more interesting.
Well, so at least some of what I hear you saying, Tova, is that learning, it's not about acquisition of knowledge, but cultivating sort of a process of learning about oneself, and that there's
it's not a zero. It's like it's part of a process, but a process is actually meeting the other.
Yeah.
You said it's developing empathy. You can't know about unless you're with. This idea of what we all are learning about the abouts.
So, but to think back to Yael's experience of being 25 and encountering diaspora Jews, one of the things that, Zionism is rooted based on a negation of the diaspora in a very real way. It's still, there's a reason why on the front page of Yediot Achronot, there are stories of anti-Semitic acts that happen in the diaspora much more than show up in, right? Like Israel oftentimes sees itself as this savior of the Jewish people. Is there a way to see a value in the
I wish they would think
Well,
that.
they see them. There's a reason why after the attacks in Paris, Netanyahu got up and said, "Come to Israel,"
After
meaning
Pittsburgh, they didn't
right.
do
And
that.
after
No, they didn't do that. Why? Because it was a conservative community.
No, that's not true.
no, but they
That's
still.
not true. And that was actually misquoted. The Rabbi was completely misquoted, if you saw it.
Yeah?
Completely. And what's so painful is that when it really came out, nobody said anything. None of the Reform conservatives said, we're sorry that we completely misquoted what David Lau had said. It was complete, taking him out. It was like
Either way, meaning like, how do you get to a place where the Jewish world in North America or in the diaspora is seen as there's a purpose for it in the Zionist narrative? That seems like an educational issue that needs to be good. And frankly, the value of Israel as an educational tool for those of us who are happy living here, especially as the axis becomes more about for those of us who are not Christian Zionists, but that Zionism gets more rooted, the Israeli government gets more rooted in Christian Zionism. So then, like, how that seems like it's political, but it's also an educational issue. How do we navigate that? Aaron?
I don't have an answer to your question. I'm just worried about two things. I don't know what you mean about is the Israeli government getting rooted in Christian Zionism?
Meaning like their connection to North America is no longer, is more and more connected to not needing the Jews. Evangelical Christians are I'm
not sure that was not the case
throughout the time. Okay,
or you think about early Zionists and their connection to British Christians.
No, for sure.
I'm not sure we're in a unique point in history. And I'd also be very cautious when you say Zionism involves a negation of the diaspora. I think what you mean to say is the Israeli government currently is often speaking about negation
I
of
think
diaspora.
other than
the
a
Israeli government is not speaking on behalf of Zionism. The Israeli government has no right to speak on
No,
behalf
but
of Zionism.
but other than Ahad Ha'am, who's maybe the most accepting of the diaspora in his writing, there aren't a huge number of early Zionist writers or mid-career Zionist writers who are thinking about the diaspora as having value.
I think that's right, but Haram has been dead for a really long time.
I know, but
and again, I mean, this is part of also my caution about the way this entire day today is structured. Zionism has changed a great deal since Ahad Ha'am. Zionism means different things to different people. For me, as somebody who grew up in Israeli, Zionism is a project that has accomplished its goals and is no longer part of the day-to-day parlance of Israeli politics. In other words, to speak of the Israeli government as promoting one stance or another about Zionism, in my mind, is like speaking about the American government promoting some sort of stance or other about the abolition of slavery. Slavery's been abolished. Zionism is done. The state of Israel is there, and the state of Israel is now moving on its own trajectory. We have to grapple with what we consider to be our Zionism, to some extent or other, but the state of Israel is not our spokesperson on this matter, and the attitudes that Bibi Netanyahu has towards the Jews of France don't represent Zionism, whatever Zionism even is.
okay. Others?
Yeah.
So.
I mean, maybe that's not a fair comparison, but I also feel like we're talking about Zionism the way one should talk about the suffrage movement. Like,
Oh yeah, I'm happy to move this to questions. Sure. Since we've heard. Yeah, please. Tell us your name and where you're from.
Sue Fishkoff, I'm the editor, Jay, and I want to get back to something that Tova was talking about and say to you, I put it to you that Jewish education is not just about teaching children. For the last 4 years, the Israeli government has held what they call a Global Jewish Media Summit, where they've invited Jewish journalists from Jewish media around the world to come to Israel for 4 days and learn, not about each other, learn about the Israeli government. And the first one I went to was 4 years ago. Of course, it's all conducted in English because that's the universal language of the Jewish people, according to the Israeli government. And we North American journalists were very happy. And there were 50 French journalists who asked all their questions in fluent Hebrew and put us to shame and said, and there was no translator for them and no translator for the 40 Russians. And I thought, this is a conspiracy between these two binary centers, the American Jewish leadership and the Israeli government, to say, we are the ones that matter. Y'all, the rest of you, you want to be a part of us, speak English and hold your conference in Israel. So I wonder how many other Jewish conferences are held in Israel with this binary focus, and I suspect all of them, and I think it's so important to open ourselves up to other centers of Jewish life.
Thank you. Anyone have a response? Josh, tell us who you are.
Josh Weinberg. I work with the Reform Movement and Israel and Zionism stuff, and currently live in New York. I just want to touch on something that I'm struggling with, and maybe you can help as educators. I think that the possibility to include more curriculum and more material and more time in the Israeli school system about the diaspora experience, whether it's Moroccan, American, Ethiopian, Jewish, all of those, I think is actually possible and could be a good first or next step. What I'm struggling is, how do you teach peoplehood to North American Jews, actually, for them to really understand? When I spend my life talking to American Jews about Israel, and I feel like it just goes like this. There's not even a resonation of what that means to be part of a Jewish people, or to have some sort of national, if that's a bad word, as Gil Troy said. But how do you begin to teach that, or curricularize that, or put that into some sort of system where a student goes to school and comes home and says, "Oh, I get it. We're part of this people. That's that we have this shared fate and destiny," or something like that.
Thoughts, Shira?
I can open that. I think at first it's important to name a challenge in North American school system in that there's no centralization of curricular material that is being taught in any school. So unlike in Israel where you can say, okay, You have a Bagriot. We know that every student will have some proficiency in Tanakh, in Mishnah, in Jewish history, in early Zionist writers, Hebrew literature. That doesn't exist. And so you have some of the, the most elite schools grappling, reinventing their curricula each year, conferences, thousands of day school educators getting, and I say to myself, like, oh my God, this isn't the first time that we're actually like structuring a curriculum. Why do we not yet have anything remotely like that? So
I will
think
say that's the introduction to the last article I wrote about rabbinic education. So
set you up there.
Yeah.
So I think just to sort of name that as a totally different model of experiences is really important in terms of, how do we educate towards people? Well, first of all, school in Palo Alto will look entirely different than Minnesota and New York and Toronto, and there just isn't this sense, even from the most basic text, where we can say, this is the Bible. This is the launching point for all of us to be having these conversations about. It's actually fascinating for me now in my capacity as Director of Education for 929, which is a Tanakh study site, to be engaged in conversations with people who are starving for content. Right? So in conversations with books for kids where you think about PJ Library sending thousands of homes, Jewish children's books, but beyond certain narratives in Genesis and Exodus, we're like, we don't have people writing books, right? What about Judges? What about the story of Devorah, Yael? Like, people just don't know that. So I think when we think about curricular work that needs to be done, we're apart from, and I will say, from the home that I just grew up in and sort of still am in kind of in some way. In the modern Orthodox community, I mean, that's why the schools cost what they do. And, my kids leave to go to school at 6:40 in the morning, come home often with their mishmar or whatever at 8 o'clock at night, men and women, kind of, my son and daughter. And so there's a lot that we're trying to do. Now, that being said, I think in those contexts, if we are deliberate about questions of education, of peoplehood, I don't imagine a new class emerging in an already very packed schedule, Peoplehood, even though some schools have identity. But you can be really deliberate in the Tanakh and Bible classes just in the sections that you teach. So if you're teaching, Esther, the Joseph narrative, Esther narrative, Ezra, Nehemiah, I mean, these are, we have thousands of years of tradition that actually grappled with what it means to be a diasporic people. Right? The Babylonian Talmud is a product of the diaspora, a very strong diaspora. So to say in your Talmud class, you can choose particular, or wherever that, whether it's for kids, adults, it actually doesn't really matter, but if sort of like that, the text, the home of text, which actually is the shared, core, we can be deliberate about inserting questions of peoplehood. What does it mean that in Babylonia, that's the Talmud that we study, even though there was an autonomous life in Israel? That was the original kind of diasporic experience. So now the Zionist experience is kind of, well, we've had this before. And they didn't have the, the luxury of hindsight of going back and saying. So I think, curricular questions are huge, but if you're deliberate, you can.
But I think what I also hear in your question, Josh, is this. North American Jews are comfortable here and don't see the need to be connected to all people. That's part of the intellectual issue. I'll just say, as a recipient of great Jewish peoplehood education and came of age at the time of Mifkashim, when Israelis and North Americans would go, and every time on your Israel trip you had to spend time with Israelis, there was nothing that made me like Israelis less than meeting them. Right? The problem with Jewish peoplehood is once you start encountering other Jews, and then you realize maybe you don't like them. Right? I say that from a place of, I was a Reform kid who actually had a Reform Jewish identity, who wanted to be engaged with Israelis, and they were like, who are you? I'm a secular North Tel Avivi. It was like, oh, you're like the cool kids that don't like me at school. Right? Meaning there's, one of the problems with all educational activities is we've put a lot of emphasis on educational activities solving our problems, and educational activities, as we heard, create more questions and are difficult. They make you wrestle with who you are, and they're hard. And so we need to think a little bit less about maybe just thinking about educational activities. There are a couple of questions. Yes, please.
I have a couple of things about this peoplehood thing. One is, there was a question about why should we be teaching diaspora story, and I've been taken a lot by, and I don't actually remember what your name is.
Ladon is right.
Right, about things that you've said. And it seems to me that one of the reasons that we teach this diaspora story, which is all of our story, is actually to bring us together to understand our whole big story. So whether you're Israeli or you're Brazilian or you're North American or whatever, we all have this bigger story and bigger connection. But getting back to, but the thing that struck me the most today was Mr. Brooks's commentary about, North American Jews talk about their connection to Judaism being through social justice and ethics and et cetera, et cetera. And he didn't say, he said that that wasn't the case with Israelis. He didn't say what Israelis' connection was, which he sort of left that out. He didn't say that. But I do think that one of the issues for our youth when it comes to peoplehood in North America, and I can't say about the Brazilians or the French or whatever, but they do feel that existential threats, I think, more than, as you said, the North Americans, although I'm feeling it now under this issue of separation of church and state issues. And I think that the issue of our children is that they have been taught these universal values that North American Jews have. And that their peoplehood, if peoplehood only means survival from the existential threat for North American Jews, if that's our connection to peoplehood, if we have to be part of this people only because we're worried about our survival, and I grapple with this too. If that's my identity as a Jew and being part of this people, is because if I'm not a Jew, I won't survive. I could be threatened for expulsion. Then I'm not sure that that's my best reason for being a Jew. And I think that if that's our polar opposite, then we still have, I'm not saying that it's a wrong, it's a pointing a finger at each other, but I think that's our misunderstanding
Of the connections.
of the connection.
Thank you.
And so that's what I grapple with, and that's what I grapple with my children. I mean, they're not, that's not what's going to connect them to being Jewish.
And you should know Mordechai Kaplan, who came up with the term peoplehood, actually says it's a throwaway term the way you just described it. We have time for one last question, so if you have a question, I've been thrilled to take, if you've got a question here, right here.
Yeah, hi. My name is Shira, and I'm the new manager of a gap year in Israel, of Mechina. And I think that Mechinot in Israel have a very good opportunity to kind of
Pre-army programs for Israelis.
Exactly. For Israelis, and you can also have students from the diaspora in our programs. And I wonder, what is your take on, if I need to put an emphasis, or I need guidelines to educate those kids, to bring together, to create this peoplehood, then what would you tell me to do?
Okay. And I'm going to ask this in a 30-second response, our different panelists. What should Israeli pre-army participants be able to say about, in what way should they encounter peoplehood? Al regel achat, in a tweet.
I think, I'm going to say something that's very not popular now. Maybe it's just because I'm tired, so I don't have any zifts. I think that's one of the most challenging years to encounter peoplehood, because at the end of that year, American kids come back to colleges and the Israeli kids go to the army. And I think without saying that it's not just that's an existential, that's that threat, and that's saying you're putting your whatever is on hold for 3 to 4 years now, and your Israeliness is what makes you do that. And Americans who come for their peoplehood experience come back here. I don't really know how to talk about that well, but I think unless it's really acknowledged in that gap year time, in the most serious way, I think it's missing a real part, because nobody's saying who has a harder life and easier life. It's not about that. Do you know what I mean? Nobody's now in a contest for who's a bigger nebuch. But there is a sense at that time what peoplehood means for Israeli kids and what peoplehood means for American kids is so different. And that really is, that's a huge gap. And that peoplehood also what it means for the parents of Israeli kids at that age, for the parents of American kids at that age. It's also, your whole parenting, mothering, fathering is so different.
Anyone else want to do a quick Ron? Yael? Go for it.
I'll say that I think I'll continue what you said, and like don't look for, first thing for the common ground, okay?
The common what?
The common ground.
Great.
Look for what is different. What does it mean to be a Jew in Israel? Most of the Israelis, they don't ask the question. I don't ask the question because I'm a Jew. I'm an Israeli. I don't ask question about my identity. And when, as like people like Jews who live here, they speak about the identity from they are 3 years old. Like they understand that there's something that is identity. And so I think first thing is not to look for the peoplehood. First thing to understand that why is there's more than one way to be a Jew, and what does it mean, and then to think together what is our relationships and what we're supposed to do together.
So I'm going to betray my social science bias and say that you should teach them about history, less about religion, more about common experience. I'm going to respectfully disagree with my host and say that if possible, you should get them to travel and meet other Jews. I'm not sure that is within your. I'm not sure that's within your budget. But if it were, wouldn't it be great to take Mechina students to North Africa, to Eastern Europe, to Latin America, to see what it's like to be a Jew
There is
there?
one program. It costs $48,000.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it's quite expensive.
what it is.
But I will reiterate what I said before. It's not the Israelis I'm worried about, because unlike Yael, who had, I think, a very different experience growing up in Israel, I met my first diaspora Jew in Israel the moment I opened my eyes in Israel. I had neighbors who were Romanian Jews. I had neighbors who were Iraqi Jews. I had neighbors who were Russian Jews. Israel is diaspora. It's everywhere. And if they serve together in the military, they're going to serve side by side with Iranian Jews, German Jews, Latin American Jews, Asian Jews. They're not the ones I'm worried about. I am worried about the Americans who live side by side with American Jews, and they eat American Jewish food, and that's all they eat. That's what they know, and they don't learn diaspora history as well as Israeli Jews. Those are the ones that I would focus on.
30 seconds, if I would maybe disagree a little bit, specifically with Yael for the Mechina program. If you want to actually look for an area of commonality so that the conversations and the encounter can take place. Here I'll just quote Fania Oz Sulzberger, and in the book that she wrote together with her father, Amos Oz, Jews and Words. Judaism is a text line, not a bloodline. It's a fascinating work, but it really kind of gets to the core of, and many people will disagree with that, but what does it mean to say Judaism is a text line, not a bloodline, right? Because then we kind of move away from these questions of in, out, and that plague much of contemporary Israeli society today. But that creates the commonality for a group, and if the specific question is about a mechina, that's a joint mechina, well, let's read something together. That is our common heritage, regardless of where you live or where you have lived and how it's been interpreted through diaspora communities throughout the world for millennia. With that as a launching point, then you can say, okay, now we can understand a little bit more about our very varied experiences at 18 years old. We're living in
Thank you. And I'll follow Tova to say, make the texts more women, more Jews not from white Ashkenazi backgrounds, and so have the learning material reflect our Jewish peoplehood. Thank you to all of our panelists.
Thank you.